Hey, good morning. I'm James, and thanks for stopping by. Today I'm doing a quick review of Lexicon by Max Berry. And I've been trying to figure out how this book came into my, how I even became aware of it. I've read Syrup by Max Berry, which was his first novel. Lexicon is his fifth, and it was published in 2013. I think Lexicon is one of those books that cycles through sales on Audible, which is probably why I had it in my Audible library. It always seemed intriguing to me. I had just never actually started reading it. So, so yeah, I mean, Lexicon coming at it, trying to break this book apart. Like if I had written this book or was trying to lay out the ideas that are in it, I probably would have done it differently. But I think obviously Barry did it the way that he did it. I struggled with this book a bit, and that's mainly because of the timeline and a timeline that involves the same characters at different times in a timeline. It might also be that I mostly listened to the book. I also had the ebook, so I was switching back and forth between listening and reading. But the book opens with a sequence with a character who is unmoored. And this is always a challenge. Like I have been taught and generally agree with this that having a protagonist that doesn't like a protagonist does not need to have all the information. Like that's part of the fun of a story is to follow a protagonist through a world as they learn, as they solve problems, as they demonstrate their skills in order to basically be a protagonist, right? They're presented with obstacles and they use whatever skills or knowledge or humanity, like, the things that make them a good person or an interesting person, that's what they use to solve these problems. Well, Lexicon doesn't start that way. It starts with a character that you don't really have a chance to know. And he is immediately attacked by people and doesn't know why he's being attacked. And so there's a lot of confusion on what's happening. And so that's the first chapter. And it took a little while to okay, I'll settle in and just, go with this. But then we move to a different character who essentially is the main character of the novel. And she is also kind of unmoored. Like she's living on the street, she's hustling with cards. She had like basically meets some mysterious people who interact with her in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. And also, we aren't getting a lot of information about her background and why she is living the way she's living. And, or at least if that information was shared, I didn't remember it. Um, it didn't. One of my kind of challenges with this book, I think, is that information about the characters is not presented as part of their worldview as we move through the story and like why they make certain decisions that they do. Um, the main character, Emily, is making decisions and doing things, but you don't necessarily know that she's doing it out of trauma, or you infer that she's doing it out of a need to survive, and she's making decisions out of a need to survive. But that's not explicitly stated as part of her character. And also, I think one of the challenges with this book, when I went back and looked at the marketing of it and how it's been sold, is the cover that I have, the one that I'm using as part of this review, definitely sells the book as a thriller. And it moves fast. It definitely has the pace of a thriller, and it has the prose is very lean and direct and moves like a thriller. But there are elements of it that really could have played out with just a lot more information. So we follow Emily as she meets these mysterious people who basically make an offer to her. Like they basically make a lot of statements and ask questions that don't make any sense. And so as the reader, you're kind of like, well, what? This doesn't make any sense. And it turns out that she is being recruited to go to a school. And this at this point, the book, like, we're following the protagonist. Um, she is it's like moving into a story, a like an academy plot. And I do like stories like that. Like, it's basically the Harry Potter plot, or I even read Fourth Wing last year because I wanted to learn what made that book successful. And that's essentially an academy plot, like following a character through trials and travails as they go to a school that has, somewhat very regimented obstacles and, you know, like levels that the character needs to advance to. But even the school isn't really portrayed in a way that makes a lot of sense. Like, a lot of the actual education that's happening at the school happens off the page, and so you're not experiencing that with her. And the driving kind of force of that part of the book becomes actually a relationship that she gets into, and she does demonstrate a desire to learn and to kind of crack the code of what it is that she's being taught. And it basically turns out that this is a school for people who are essentially modern day wizards who manipulate language in order to control people. And so they break humans down into what they call segments or personality types. And based on those personality types, they know control words that can be used to make people do what they want. So now the gibberish that she was being told before starts to make more sense, and what she experienced makes more sense. So while this is happening, this is being intercut with the character from the first chapter, who it turns out is being pursued by a group of people that we don't know who they are. And there's a lot of action scenes that we don't really know why they're happening or what, it's action, that's cool, but there's no purpose to it because we don't know what the circumstances are. We just know that they're being pursued. And there's an interaction between the sort of portal character that brought you into this world and then a kind of a ride along character who's supposed to, in a normal story, in another story, would be giving more information about this world and helping the protagonist like settle in so they can make decisions and start being a protagonist. But because of the way this character is set up, he never actually gets to be a protagonist. He's basically just kind of dragged along through these situations by this other character as he tries to understand what's going on. And it becomes clear throughout the book that the sections with Emily in the school are happening much earlier in time, and the sections with the other character, Will, are happening later in time. But it's not explicit about that, and so it takes a while to kind of figure out. And then the thing that's pulling you through the book is trying to figure out how these two storylines are going to come together. Well, Emily doesn't spend a lot of time in the academy, which, an academy, the other thing that kind of scenario can do in a story is it's a great way to world build and bring the character along with you, because you have a sense of wonder and there's all kinds of interesting emotion tied up in the idea of going to school. And I think that always intrigues people and they want to read about that. If you can put a character in a learning situation and challenge them with, levels and tests they have to overcome, there's always a certain amount of, like tension there. And that tension will need to be resolved in some way. The character either needs to pass and graduate or fail and deal with the consequences of what happens. Well, Emily fails because of a personal decision that she makes. And it's still not even clear that it's her fault that this thing happens. Well, certain people within the organization are sort of introduced. There is a main antagonist that is introduced, but we never really get a chance to know these people. And part of the problem is that we learn in this organization, they don't use their names. They all go by the names of poets. And so the antagonist's name is Yates, and there's Plath, and Emily eventually becomes named Wolf. And so there's also baggage related to those names, and you're kind of trying to figure out, like, why Virginia Woolf? Like, I like Virginia Woolf. I don't necessarily relate Virginia Woolf to what this character ultimately ends up doing. Like, not at all. So, also she's not well, maybe she wrote poetry. I'd have to look that up, I guess. So that's still cool. Like, I like the idea of a secret organization where everybody calls themselves by poets. I think the story probably has to acknowledge that, 99% of the population isn't going to know what that means if they did interact with these people. And we also don't get a good sense of what they're actually doing in the world. Like, information, there's in between chapters, there's kind of a, articles and different pieces of information are presented. And that's another challenge because you don't know how important that information is. And there is one point where a myth is given that is longer than all the other things, which were articles and snippets and things like that, which kind of makes them seem like they could be skipped, like they're not important. And if I'm a person reading a thriller and something is holding me up from getting into the next chapter, I might skip that. So that's the kind of information that I would like to get in the story. And it turns out that some of that is very important because as I went back and was trying to find, more information about this book once I finished it, I really try not to read Amazon reviews anymore while I'm reading a book because, I mean, A, spoilers, B, people's opinions are often bad, or you can tell they didn't read the book very closely. And I just don't want that affecting my experience with a story anymore. I get pretty tired of it. I know from my own reviews that people don't read very closely, but that is what it is. So I learned more about okay, there is some subtle world building in the story that may explain some things that happen, but it's just not explicit. And one of the things I think with thrillers is if a book is going to be a thriller, typically it's not hiding anything. Like one of the, sort of tropes or, things that thrillers are criticized for is that you get antagonists that, just want to speechify about all their plans and plots, right? Well, that's a way to communicate with the reader exactly who the antagonist is and exactly what they want. Like nobody is trying to figure out what Dr. Evil wants, right? Dr. Evil wants what he wants. And then not James Bond in this case, but I'm blanking on shoot. It'll come to me. But you're not blanking on what the hero is trying to do, right? You know exactly what the bad guy wants, and you know exactly what the hero is trying to accomplish. And this is killing me, so I'm gonna look it up because it's Austin Powers. Why would I forget Austin Powers? If you haven't watched Austin Powers, which I guess there's a whole new generation of readers and viewers that have not watched Austin Powers, definitely check it out, and then watch Bond films, or even watch Bond films first, or read some Ian Fleming, because Ian Fleming is great, and then watch Bond films, and then watch Austin Powers, and you will really appreciate what they're trying to do with those movies, because they're pretty genius. Mike Myers does some great stuff. So anyway, in a thriller, that's typically you just know what it is, right? And this is a book that's trying to be, I think, a little more literary because a lot of the things that the organization does and the why of how the characters are operating is below the surface. And you'd have to read carefully to pick up some of these details. So the other challenge I had with this is that the antagonist, Yates, really does not start playing a big role until probably the last third of the book. And the main character is set up in such a way and doesn't have a lot of interaction with Yates except as a concept at the school. And so the idea that Yates manipulates her in such a way using the power that they have, okay, at this point that can make sense, but it would be more satisfying for me if there was a bit more of an interaction between them. And that interaction is there, but I'd also like to know what Yates wants. And this book it's hard to make that clear because part of the challenge of it is tied up in how the magic essentially works and how the magic has expressed itself through our history, which has to do with how language works and, the idea of the Tower of Babel or a Babel event or people being split into different languages. And there might be a base language that controls humans. And also at this point, I was thinking a lot about Snow Crash, and because it was killing me that I was pretty sure I'd read other books that have the same sort of concept, that in Snow Crash it was Sumerian, but there's a sub language that basically controls how humans think, which, was kind of a mind-blowing concept to me when I first learned it, that, you know, in a lot of ways, our memories don't begin until we start to speak for most people. And language shapes so much of our worldview and our ways of thinking. That's fascinating. And it really changed. It's why it's so valuable to learn other languages, because it's one of the ways you can really start to empathize with other people and how they see the world, because they see it through a different lens of description and communication than, say, we do with English, which is a pretty crazy language in a lot of ways. Um, it's a very flexible language. It's a language that eats other languages. And so there's a lot of things about English that we don't even realize. We're using words that come from other languages. And that's really interesting. I mean, I John Gardner, an author who has written a lot of writing guides, had a whole rant about Saxon words versus Latin words, and how Saxon words are solid and direct, and Latin words are soft and squishy. And I still kind of think about that. Like, I'm sort of an etymology nerd. I like to know what's happening with, like, what words mean, but I don't typically think exactly about the words I'm using in a sentence, and when it comes to really being direct and solid about what the sentence is doing. But those sort of subtle things are what this book is about. It doesn't get super deep into it, because that's the other piece, is that the words that they use, at least I didn't go back and like Google these words to figure out if they did have some kind of meaning, but that would have been interesting. Maybe if there was more about that. The time frame of the book, like, people have cell phones. I think for 2013 it was meant to be contemporary, because people are basically, the tools they're using, cars, technology, it's all pretty modern day for how they're solving problems and things like that. So getting back to Yeats, we really don't get into Yeats's head until later in the book. And this is always a challenge. Like, if the author is going to introduce a very important character and the reader doesn't get to know them until late in the book, although they've had an impact on events before, if you don't know that character's motivations, it sort of saps a lot of the tension out of that. And it turns out that Yeats, like, is religious. And so, okay, you're kind of thinking about that. Like, that's interesting. A wizard who is religious. But then that's sort of undermined by the fact that he has a tumor. And the tumor is what was causing these religious thoughts. And he's aware of this. So it sort of sapped for me a lot of the tension around this character and why he's doing what he's doing. So yeah, when there are scenes ultimately where this character, like, prevails against the protagonist, Emily, but it's not earned. It's kind of like, well, she was pretty awesome. How did he manage to beat her? Like, he kind of used her own weakness against him, but because I've been closer to her throughout the whole story, I really thought she was going to win. I didn't see any reason this guy had earned his ability to beat her. And then that leads into a whole sequence where she kind of has to come back against the evil wizards. And ultimately the way that she defeats them didn't make sense to me. The last part of the book is really about the character Will, who is at the beginning, and more information is given. There's, like, basically his memory was erased and he's a different person. And so he transitions from being, like, not having any agency to a person who's, like, awesome, almost super soldier. And that's something that wasn't, I don't remember it being said that he was in the military. Like, this is taking place in Australia, and they really don't get into his past. Like, part of his background is he's a person who does not feel the need to talk a lot about things in his life. Like, he expresses himself through actions. And that was a really interesting tension between Emily, a character who needs to talk everything out, and him, Harry, who doesn't need to do that. Like, I do things for you to express my love. I don't have to tell you I love you. And so that was an interesting tension in the book that kind of gets to it, because he is immune to this word magic. And also the reasons for that are never fully explained. And even at the end, when it's sort of expressed that people might be have the ability to be immune if they're bilingual or grew up learning two languages. And so the base languages that can impact people, the way the brain processes that language can affect or basically make them, less likely to be controlled by it. And that's also interesting, but that's information I would have liked to have had at the beginning of the book, because it seems like if you're in wizard school learning how to control people with language, that's pretty important information if you're going to try and control a person who is bilingual. And I mean, I don't know. I lived in El Paso for 4 years. Like, there were people that would just code switch between English and Spanish like it was nothing, and actually had meaning itself. Like, if somebody, you know, is speaking English in front of you and then switches to Spanish, why? What are you doing? And, there were things like that I learned Spanish. So like I could start, I'm still not, I can read Spanish. But it definitely it is a form of communication when people do that. That also is not necessarily communicated in this story. And again, it's a thriller. And I think that's my biggest challenge with this book, is I felt like it could have been a lot more. Like the whole Academy story, I was really reminded of The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And the book is not at all like The Magicians. I don't know why I was feeling that. I think it's a modern day sort of fairy tale where magic exists. And if you can learn the magic, hand signs that they do in The Magicians, you can manipulate magic. And in this case, it was just the words. But the characters that are interacting with this are contemporary and get caught up in, teenage drama, basically, and act like, 20 somethings. And so that's cool. That's compelling. And even the Magicians, like, if that's a book I wish had gone, a series that I wish had gone deeper into what it was. I kind of thought the show worked better for me than the books did, because I liked the show and you got a much deeper sense of the world building from the show. So the way this book ends, like, it ends on an upbeat, and it seems like it's going to end as a tragedy, and then it doesn't. And I'm glad, I'm happy for the characters that it ended the way they did. I did feel their love affair throughout the story. I thought that was the most compelling part of the book for me, when Emily, the main character, has to basically go out into the desert and kind of rebuild her life. And sure enough, she meets a man, she falls in love. Like, she goes through trials and has to overcome them, falls in love, and like, no sooner has she been living a life that's great, the organization shows back up and pulls her out of it. And then it's kind of, that's the driving force in the book, is how she's going to get back to that. So I would still recommend this book. I think for anyone, I think also for, writers, a book with a off timeline, like this book it's challenging, and maybe it would have been easier for me to follow it if I had just been straight up reading it as opposed to listening to it. But that was probably my biggest challenge with the book, is there were times I just didn't know when something was happening. Maybe it would have helped if there were date markers on the chapters. Maybe. I don't know. Especially as we get further away from 2013. I don't know how much that would matter, but also the further we get away from, like 2013, that's, 12 years ago now, that already sort of feels like alternate reality, weird to say, but you start to get to a point where the details can shift or be different. And now putting date markers on a chapter make it a little more like science fiction, fantasy kind of thing. I liked the main character. I wanted her to succeed. I did not understand some of her decisions. Like, there's a whole sequence where she basically ends up working in this sort of research facility that is doing work, it looks like, on how linguistics affect, proles, everybody else. And then the whole way that she sort of infiltrates it felt a little easy to me. Like, this organization was smarter than what she was able to do to infiltrate it. But it was still compelling. Like, I still just kind of went along with it. I was like, okay, like, it's kind of fun to watch her do this. Even though it's kind of the linchpin that the book rests on, as far as how she gains her ability to fight back against the organization and Yates. And going back to Yates, like, I don't like how the antagonist was undermined by giving him a tumor. And also, he just wanted to rule the world. And to me, that's not a great incentive. That's just taking on a whole lot of other problems that shouldn't really appeal to a lot of people if they really think about it. I mean, I feel like the happiest billionaires, like nobody even knows their name, right? So it's still a compelling book. And I would still, if it comes up, on sale, you've got an opportunity to check it out, I definitely would recommend it. I think studying thrillers, this would be an interesting comparison to other contemporary thrillers and what is marketed as a thriller. I think if someone had come to this book strictly from the world of like the Gray Man and, Brad Thor and things like that, they probably would be disappointed in this book. This is not a book about like special operators solving problems and using the tools they have. But there are definitely character arcs. Like this is a book that you watch a character go from 0, to 10 and then get nerfed back down to 5 and have to build their way back up. So that was compelling. Yeah, I think if you also haven't engaged with linguistics, this would be an interesting entry point into that. And what linguistics, signs, memes, they kind of started. I mean, this is 2013, so he did suggest some of the things that have come into play in our world as far as memes and how memes move across the internet or just memes move across networks and how the meaning in a meme can change and how it can affect people, which is essentially what the magic was about. Although in 2013, those aren't the terms that people were using. So, I mean, I was at a party in like I want to say it was maybe 2018, talking to a person who was doing their master's thesis on memes, and I laughed at first. I was like, really? And when they went down the whole rabbit hole on the meaning of it, like this was before really I feel like, well, maybe this had to be earlier than that because 2016 I really feel like memes started becoming more mainstream. But yeah, I did not appreciate that. And so I have now when I've read more about memetics and how those things influence the way they create movements, how people think. And this is a book that touches on that. So that is definitely interesting. And I'd also recommend Syrup, like the other book that I've read by Max Berry, which was more just funny and playful. And I'll check out more books by him. I do really find the stuff he's doing interesting. I like it when, an author has ideas and just kind of throws them out. And it's like other authors could pick those ideas up and turn them into like a whole epic fantasy, you know? Um, so this is definitely an interesting book in that regard. So yeah, Lexicon by Max Berry. And thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time.